This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Welcome to episode 21 of the Practice of Learning Teams. Today's podcast is the second of a series of 4 episodes as we take the podcast on a virtual tour of Australia and looking at how the Australians are applying learning teams to improve organisational learning. On today's show, we are joined by Stephen Harvey and Tony McConachie from Urban Utilities. Urban Utilities is one of the largest water distributor-retailers in Australia. They manage and maintain a vast network of more than 18,000 kilometres of water and sewer pipe, which, if laid end to end, would stretch from Australia to London. From their infrastructure maintenance and IT departments to customer-facing contact centre and community engagement teams, their workforce plays a part in keeping the water flowing and the toilets flushing for 1.4 million people in Queensland, Australia. On today's podcast, Stephen and Tony will share their learning team's journey and we will explore a range of views, including learning teams versus ICAM and TapRoot, the importance of having a strategy to embed learning teams, the power of storytelling, the role of HSRs, who are workplace health and safety reps, in learning teams, using learning teams for critical risk analysis, dealing with larger groups in learning teams, the importance of the facilitator to reflect to improve performance, the importance of coaching and mentoring others, and finally the importance of post-job review and feedback into the system for learning. Let us now start the conversation with Stephen Harvey.
I look after 5 council areas. Probably got about 1,000 staff. Basically, we've been on a Safety 2, Safety Differently journey for about 3 years now.
Excellent, thank you. And yourself, Tony?
Yeah, so my name's Tony McConachie. I've been taking a bit of a lead role in helping to operationalise the Safety Differently, the Safety 2 and HOP thinking. So my role over the past 3 years has sort of been to help draft and develop and implement the strategy around how we will, I guess, focus initiatives to help realise some of the theory. So yes, Steve and I have been partnering up on this journey for, approaching 3 years now.
Oh, that's great. And from your perspective, how did the learning team journey start? Did you see it as being part of HOP? Did you see it as being something separate, part of Safety Differently? How did the learning journey start? Who convinced you?
For me, Brent, I was sort of starting to get into this stuff probably about 2014, 2015. And I was starting to introduce some of the concepts into a business. I worked in a labour hire organisation, and I could never influence, or I could never have an impact on the businesses who were having events. But what I thought to myself is, well, we're a big part of this sort of event too. It'd be our people that were getting injured. So what I would do is I would bring our team. So we would send people to host employers, and then they would get injured. And then the host employers would say, no, but we'll do our own investigation. You guys have got nothing to do with this. So I would bring our own team in and sort of say, right, let's have a discussion. Let's just let's sort of have a reflection, basically, on how we could have improved this interaction with the client. So I started doing that about 2014, 2015, and then I was really trying to push my organisation to start doing some more of this, but they were embedded in ICAM. That was their thing. That's all they wanted to do. But that's okay. I could still use some of my learnings from readings like Todd Conklin's work and seeing some of Bob Edwards' activities. That's basically where it came from for me. And then when I came into Urban Utilities, we started doing some work with Southpack, and we've done the HOP training there, and it's just really, that's what's pushed us on from that sort of time. It's Whereas before it was sort of, I would just try and on an ad hoc basis. At Urban Utilities, we were really like, no, we want to do this. This is the way to go. So we were really focusing on learning a lot.
Yeah, so, and I'll add to that, I guess. So the reason for wanting to have a crack at learning teams was we had a clear, evident problem to solve in the organisation. So the approaches that we were taking to try and learn, we were using TapRoot and ICAM to try and learn from when things go wrong. We also had a position of operations getting further and further away from the health and safety function. And there was a big gap in terms of what actually went on out at site versus what health and safety got told. So we found ourselves in a pretty defensive, passive and aggressive defensive position. And there was a clear lack of information flowing between head office and out at site. And so it was about 4.5 years ago, Kim Bancroft joined as our health and safety manager. I've never worked in health and safety until she joined 4.5 years ago. I'm a change management background. And what I saw from this new view of safety got me super excited. I started reading up about it, listening to all the podcasts, learning from Steve and Kim, and we had a real appetite for change there. So our CEO and our executives they wanted to do something different. So we already had the flame had been lit as such. So we had that kind of momentum of people wanting to try something else out because it was just not working. So that's when the new strategy sort of came into play. We developed the new strategy 3 years ago. And part of that strategy was trying to frame safety as that ethical responsibility rather than a bureaucratic one. And what fell underneath that was, well, we need to change the way that we learn about work. Well, we weren't learning about work beforehand. So we want to learn from normal work. And how do we do that? Well, we clearly do that through the learning teams approach. So we've tried to flip learning from incidents to actually just trying to learn from normal work through the learning teams and the work insights approaches, which we can talk a little bit about.
Sure. So from what I'm hearing, you've identified the learning opportunities from everyday work activities.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're still using it for a little bit of event-based. And are you using it, Tony, for management of change?
Yeah, so this is what I really love about learning teams is we use it for our decluttering projects. So we use customer-based design methodology as well as ProSci methodologies for change. But within that, we've embedded the learning teams approach through the gates of change that we maneuver through with all of our projects and milestones that we've built that map to the objectives of our strategy. So the learning teams they're a critical part of the early part of the projects and also the evaluation. So all the way through it, we've adopted learning teams through management of change. That's a key part of it. But I love it because we use it to learn from awkward jobs. We use it to learn from near misses. Like the guys love it because they have the same experience when something goes wrong as they do for when we just want to talk about a post-job review. So it's the same constructive, no blame, those HOP principles. It's the same experience. And those stories start to kind of circulate out at site and become the norm. So it's been successful, but I mean, the stories of success take longer to replace stories of blame from years ago. So it has taken, it's a slow burn to replace those blame stories.
Right. No, I can understand that because you've got an institutional element that's going to exist. It takes time. It's not necessarily trust, it's just that sort of onset of things. And look, in the book, The Practice of Learning Teams, we actually, we push this concept of operational learning further. We describe the fact that what in a learning team, what the organisation learns from a learning team and what workers learn is actually quite different. And a lot of what we're capturing at the moment is actually about organisational learning. And we're not often having that reflective conversation with the workers about what they gain from it. And we push it even further. We even asked the question, what did the facilitator learn from it as well? Because those reflective components have to sit across all those stakeholders in that way.
Do you mean reflections as a facilitator, or what we discover as part of...
No, as a facilitator.
Yeah.
Because if we don't, so I think there's two things. We have this notion that we want to build this critical reflection or critical thinking skill with workers.
Mm-hmm.
We want them to be able to recognise when something moves away from its standard mode or its normal mode. I don't know how you guys feel, I don't think it's possible that we can train workers to identify abnormal modes or failure modes. We're probably more begin to identify when something moves away from its normal, what they expect it to see. And that requires them to be able to critically reflect. And part of the thing that we've been looking at is how to do the learning team in a way that actually builds that critical reflection skill with workers by being part of a learning team. So that learning becomes intentional rather than learning as incidental. So
Brent, one of the things that I do whenever I get a bunch of teams together was, like, I suppose probably, like, I've done something on chemicals. I've done sort of a bit of discovery on chemical use in the business. And I said to the guys, tell me your chemical stories. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't even like an official sort of learning team. It was just, I just had the guys together and I had them all talking about the stories of how they've misused chemicals, how they use chemicals. And it created a fabulous conversation. And I've done that quite a lot. Get the guys to say, hey, tell me your excavation stories. Tell me, you're used to when you're driving vehicles, tell me what stories, what near misses are you getting. And it just captures this beautiful story about work and real work. And I'd like to think that the guys are learning from that too. Even just when we're just having those nice little, they're not, they totally are off the record actually. They're just sort of, I'm not capturing any information. It's just getting the guys to talk about work.
And I think purely by them sharing the narrative amongst themselves, because they're within their own peers, there is some form of transference of learning.
Correct, totally.
We would ask, is that incidental or should that be deliberate? So how can we do the learning team so that becomes a deliberate function or process rather than an incidental process? That's what we think is the interesting challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we've been sort of getting the HSRs to take a bit of a role in sharing back some of those learnings. So we get the HSRs for a full day every month. So we change that from an hour and a half to a full day, and we break that in half basically. So half the day is heading out to site and doing some critical control work insights. So learning about high risk work as done, so normal high risk work. And then the other half of the day is to actually get them to suggest learning team topics for us to sort of have a crack at going through either one or two tasks and activities that they do. So we can actually gather some really good, rich stories and then share those back through the crews, through the voice of the workers, to share them at toolbox talks, shared operational learning updates, making sure that people are learning from, verbal updates from people in their own team rather than from someone from health and safety.
Absolutely, yeah, and that contextualisation of risk becomes so important. And that's what systems aren't good at.
Yeah, I think the guys will take I'm really sort of focused on not telling the guys about events that have happened. I'd like them to try and find it out for themselves, or that's a big thing for me. If it comes from their peers and HSRs, like just the stories are better. Like these guys are on the same level, so they can. I just think the stories sink in better when it doesn't come from someone like me. Even though I've got a great relationship with the guys in the field, it's still important that they're sort of capturing those stories from each other.
Yeah. Well, you're never going to be that person in the field.
Never. It's too hot out there, too dirty.
Because we have this saying that it's only workers who are exposed to residual risk.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, no one else is exposed. So yeah, they're always going to learn more from their peers than from someone else. So if we think about that, what do you think makes a successful learning teams facilitator on your journey? What makes someone good at doing learning teams?
I suppose I can have a crack at that first.
Steve thinks he's pretty good at them. He is.
I am pretty good at them. I'm going to give him a slap in the back here. For me, Brent, is like, I'm pretty strong when it comes to learning teams. Like, I don't mind telling people to shut up in a nice way. So I will set the scene right from the very beginning, saying, look, I won't really tolerate people talking over each other. But I try and do it in a fun way, in a jokey way. And it definitely comes across like that. So I'll say to the guys, like, everyone will get a say. Everyone will get equal amounts of opportunity to talk and tell us the stories of what's happening in the field. So for me, it's really about making sure that the room is nice and safe, like creating psychological safety for those guys to talk. And I've been really lucky over the past couple of years to force those relationships so that they do talk. And sometimes, even for me, some of those stories can be quite confronting. Mm-hmm. So that's probably one of the great strengths that I have, is I'm able to sort of keep the room controlled and keep everyone sort of focused. If I start to see side conversations happening, I'll get up out of my chair and I'll go and tap them on the shoulder, or else I'll just say to them, "Hey, shut up! I'm trying. Like, you'll get your say in a minute." And then I caveat that though by saying, "Like, you guys are probably talking about something really brilliant there, and we're going to miss out on it because you're not telling us all." So that's probably a couple of the things that I'm really quite strong on when it comes to learning team facilitation. What about you, Tony?
I think the thing that I try and drill in with all of our leaders that do facilitate learning teams, and even when I'm doing them myself, is to be ridiculously curious just about normal work. So don't get hyper excited or really keen and intense around a particular event if something does go wrong. So we really try and reinforce with our facilitators that just ask nice, open questions and draw out the stories from everyone within the room. So that preparation piece, we really sort of hone in on making sure, as a facilitator and the scribe, be aware of your roles, prepare some line of questioning, and leave a really chunky element of freedom within that line of questioning, but know what you want to try and achieve at the end of the learning team approach. So it's not just a wild conversation where lots of stories are uncovered. So that ability to kind of think in the moment and theme and pattern as you are actually going through the learning theme is really important to sort of draw out and connect the dots. So the scribe and the facilitator together, essentially partnering through the process, but also using that soak time really, really effectively in the middle of the process to kind of check in and actually review, analyse, and check in for what are those things that we want to learn from once we do move out of discovery. Yeah. So actually you should actually be pretty exhausted at the end of a learning team, because you're actually thinking intensely about what's going on in the room and reading people and drawing out the necessary bits of critical information about work. And then to Todd's point as well, Todd Conklin, like, you really, once you get to the event, it's pretty boring. It's not all that exciting. So you should have learned everything you need to learn by your conversations on normal work around that topic. So if it's excavation and trenching, you just talk about how does that normally play out for you? Let's talk about it. The event is completely separate to that first learning team anyway. The event is not spoken about at all. in the first learning team. So yeah, the facilitator's role is to keep people away from the event and learn about normal work. And then the secondary learning team, the facilitator needs to engage around the event itself. But the learnings are far less juicy once you actually get to the event itself. You've got everything you need.
And we sort of describe it like a pyramid. That first thing around problem identification, it's about depth and breadth, and getting that deepness, and that last layer of the pyramid should have a lot of deepness. And then after your soak time, you're then going to turn it into a diamond shape. We're then going to narrow down from that depth and really get into the guts of it in that way. And do you think, I mean, from your perspective, guys, what's an ideal size for a learning team? What have you been finding through this process?
Well, mate, I've done one that I thought was really, really amazing. There was only 2 people there. And then I've done one that I found quite challenging, and there was about 12 people in the room, I think. So ideally, the last one that I did with Tony, funny enough, was we'd had a bit of discovery around checklists with our HSR team, and there was about 6 in the room, and that was excellent. That was perfect size.
Yeah.
We were able to get lots of people, lots of interaction from everyone, lots of fair comments, and yeah, that was, I found that was like an ideal number. It was a great session.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, our procedure.
Yeah.
Sorry, our procedure does state normally around 6 attendees. It states in our process, and that's the people that do the work. No one else in the room for the learning team. No SMEs, no leaders.
Right.
It's the people that have tools in their hands. That's it.
So what we found, and we actually published, there was some research that we found that basically said what's the ideal size for people to look at complex issues. And it basically said 3 to 8 was optimum. So it said you need a minimum of 3, so 1 or 2, they're the same. You need a minimum of 3 and about 8. And it said there was no gain after 8. What we've typically seen is that once you start getting past about 8, personalities start to come more into play. So we've done learning teams with up to 40 people, but what we do is we have multiple facilitators performing different functions and different roles to do that. So we have a big group, then we might break them into smaller groups, and we do like different presentation things with them so that everyone gets involved. But yeah, from a facilitation point of view, it's really hard. If you get a big group, it's taxing.
Yeah, well, that one I was talking about where we were trying to get the guys to come up with some solutions around excavations, that was quite a big group, and we just couldn't, they kept breaking off into little chats themselves, and I found myself getting a bit frustrated actually, because I kept telling me, come on, get back in, come back in. So I totally agree with the research there. If it's between 3 and 8, I concur, yeah.
Yeah, so that wasn't on learning teams, that was just on complex solving complex things. It was actually about solving complex maths. Okay, and it was really good research. So, because a bit like Dave Proven and Drew Ray, I'm quite keen on some of the science that sits behind this as well. So we went out and looked to try and find some science in that. So you guys definitely in the right path.
I actually had Dave Proven sit in on one of my learning teams, Brent. That was quite he was doing some work at Urban Utilities, and he came in and sat in the room while I was doing it. And then afterwards I said, "Oh, that was brilliant, Dave." And he's like, "Oh, well, you could have done this better. You could have done that better." It was awesome. It was good to get the feedback.
Absolutely, it's really, really helpful, because the thing is, no one is ever going to be a master. I mean, every time we run learning teams, as I said before, we do a deep reflective practice. So that, because we believe that we can learn something from every single thing that we do. Mm-hmm. And if you don't do that, then it basically, you sort of end up being slightly arrogant that you've mastered it. Yeah, and that's part of that whole process, because it is difficult, because as safety people, we have been used to being the expert, to being a knowledge holder, to being a domain owner. That's what we've done.
No, I mean, I don't know if I would agree with you on that. Maybe in the past I might have been like that, but certainly since I've started discovering sort of the work that we're doing now, I always have reflections on what I could do better, and I would never, like I often tell people when I'm conducting my sort of learning activities, I do not know what I'm doing here. I'm super curious, and I will ask you lots and lots and lots of questions. But I've never ever felt that I was the gatekeeper, like I was the holder of all knowledge.
So I suppose what we're saying there is, how did you develop that skill?
Oh, geez, I don't know. I don't know if it's just me being a humble Glaswegian. But yeah, I don't quite know. I've just always, I think probably since I've discovered the work of Sidney Dekker and all that sort of thing. Maybe.
Yeah, so about being curious.
Yeah, I think I've sort of just realised, definitely in the past, that I was one of those safety people that you did not want in your organisation. But I think probably for the last 5-6 years, I have become really curious about work, and I definitely know there's so much to learn. And in the couple of years I've been at Urban Utilities, I've probably quadrupled my knowledge base just from being here, just be surrounding myself with people like Tony.
Correct. So you've basically said you've come from being that expert mode to come into that facilitative mode, and that's taken you a period of time. And your skill, do you think your skills changed over time?
Facilitation skills?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. But was that done was that incidental or was that deliberate planning?
Oh, I would say that was definitely incidental. But again, surrounding myself with, Tony's an absolutely brilliant facilitator.
Yes.
So when you see him doing his, not even when it's coming to learning teams, just when in general, his facilitation skills, you actually, much is caught, not taught. So if you surround yourself with amazing facilitators like what we have in our team, you actually, you will sort of catch their skills.
So I'll give you one brief example. So before we came into the team, the monthly HSR catch-up went for an hour and a half, and the facilitators of that meeting spoke for 1 hour and 29 minutes of that an hour and a half, and the HSRs just sat there and listened. Mm-hmm. So it was a monologue, delivery, listen, shut up, get out the door. But now we get them for a full day, and Steve and I are just asking nothing but curious questions and listening and taking notes. That's all we do. We just continually keep asking questions. We know nothing. We just keep asking questions. And that's it. It's that simple.
So this is where the interesting conversation comes up. If the desire is to ultimately try and get some of your HSRs to become facilitators in their own right, what's going to be the better path? Them learning incidentally or creating a learning framework to make it deliberate for them so they can hone that skill?
Oh, yeah. I think with the skills that Tony and I have, if we had our HSRs doing it, they would learn from the way that we so they would be learning incidentally. But I just don't know if they've got the strength like what we have to be able to just keep asking questions. I think that's a real skill to just keep asking. So we'd probably have to create a framework around that.
You like everything else, you've got to get them into a mode they can sort of develop from. But when I say an organisation, what does that mode look like? They just shake their head. So we don't know.
Yeah, we've started the process. So all leaders, all HSRs come through a really beautifully developed program which we've called Safe Simple, and that's our approach to operationalising the safety differently and HOP and even HRO principles within our business. And there's a full day of that on learning. So how do we shift safety from being less of a bureaucratic responsibility into more of that ethical space? And so we do a full day around scenarios and simulations of like practicing and fumbling your way through having a crack at facilitating some learning teams in that environment, and we sort of help to coach and guide and advise. And we also just do like little pockets of learning around event learning and how we can sort of embed that in everyday life as well. So we're doing a lot of like educating and influencing in those types of forums, which has helped some way, but we probably haven't jumped in and just gone, you know what, let's just get them to start having a crack, and we can coach and guide and advise them through it. So we probably just need to just jump into the water and have a go.
See what happens. And obviously you guys are really innovating well in that whole safety to safety differently space. How do you feel about learning teams being used in traditional safety?
Oh, geez.
It'd be a disaster.
Yeah, I think the... There you go, Tony.
Yeah, look, I think the timing has to be right. Like, you do have to have an agreement at CEO level, executive level. So we developed the strategy and got sign off an agreement to change how we viewed error and how we viewed work and how that plays out. So we got sign off to make those changes from the very top, from the board level, CEO down. So you do actually have to get that first, but you also have to have at least a culture that has progressed to a degree where it can be accepted and acknowledged and valued as an approach. So we were quite lucky that over the previous 5 years at Urban Utilities, we've shifted our culture from an aggressive and defensive type nature to something that was becoming a little bit more humanistic and encouraging in its style. So we had turned the dial outside of the safety world, but the safety world still had a bubble of dysfunction. So the timing was right. Like, you do have to have that. Like, you do have to have a willingness for people to want to change because there's a problem. So we were lucky that we had some really willing execs and area managers and general managers in operations that just were like, gimme, just give us more of this. Like, they really embraced it with open arms. Doesn't mean that we've been perfect in our response every time when inevitably something does go wrong. But look, timing is everything.
Yeah, and I think it goes like the question about learning teams in a sort of safety one style organisation. Like, it really depends on their level of maturity, Brent. Like, I've worked in, I've partnered with a lot of these organisations over the years, and the thirst for blame is strong. Yep. So, like, when you're going into, like, even if I was doing some work with some organisations now, I would like when you point the finger, there's always three pointing back, and I will find those three conditions that existed that led to that guy making that error.
Yeah.
So
error is normal. That's right.
Yeah, totally. So I think it would really depend on the maturity of the organisation. But like I said, blame is strong in some of these sort of less mature thinking organisations.
Well, and blame is inherent to us as humans. Mm-hmm. When we make our own mistakes, your voice isn't saying you're wonderful, Steve. You know, your voice is saying, what the hell? You know, you're better than this. You're better than this. And then your other voice is going to come in. It probably sounds a bit like your mother. Your other voice is going to come in and say, it's okay, son. Everything's going to be good later on.
Yeah, I definitely beat myself up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. Yeah.
So blame's part of that inherent process. Yeah. But that's the difference between the inner voice and the outer voice, as we say.
Yeah, so like the learning tech approach can be bastardized just like all of the other previous health and safety processes and investigation methods have been. So the 95% of the battle is what goes on in your brain in terms of how you respond. It's all about how you respond, and that whole principle is we've really tried to instill that of people not getting hyper excited when inevitably things go wrong, and they do all the time.
Yeah. And our objective is to try and make the learning team stand by itself as well, particularly by basically saying that we should be able to use learning teams to get deeper and more meaningful understanding of just what normal work looks like. We recently did a piece of work that pushed the notion of blue line, black line by extending it further to basically say that there's some other modes that happen in between. And that, it just doesn't, what we're talking about is that risk ebbs and flows through the organisation and through the supply chain and the contract chain. And as it ebbs and flows, those different groups see it in a different way. And so the examples we talk about, you've got work as imagined, you've got work as disclosed, work as reported, work as done, all these things ebb and flow. And that's because everyone is looking at it within their own domain, if that makes sense.
Yeah, mate, I would probably say that's one of the big changes that we've had here, is we've changed the language that we use as well. So we're constantly talking about learning, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But I think for the guys in the field, when we talk about like work is imagined, work is done, that really resonates with people. So we sort of, the way that I sort of talk about it is I'll go into the field and say to the guys, right, so the people in the head office, the work is done land, blah, blah, work is imagined land, blah, blah, blah. I need to sort of try and get to how work is really done in the field and then try and close that gap. So I think that's one of the things that the guys in the field really, really resonate with.
Right. And I think that's interesting because at the end of the day, we have to plan regardless. Planning has to exist. And that's really what Work as Imagined is all about. But Work as Imagined, as you know, can't cater for every potential variable and scenario or thing that happens on that daily basis. That's what we're relying on humans. I mean, COVID-19 has proven that systems are brittle and people are adaptable. We had things that were heavily compliant-based that the regulators basically put a stop to during COVID. And no one died because those things had been stopped. But prior to COVID, if you hadn't been doing those things, that would have been a breach of a regulation. Okay.
Yeah, so just when you were saying there about planning, it's one of my favourite tools is the post-job review. I just don't do enough of them though. I just wish, when I first arrived here, the boys were doing a big job over a railway line, and I got them in and we had this discussion, and it was amazing, absolutely amazing. Some of the conversations that were coming up about managing multiple contractors and the wrong equipment turning up. It was really a fabulous conversation, but it's just something I don't do enough of. The learning that you can get from work after it's been done is just incredible.
Yeah, and look, in the book we actually give a couple of examples, real-life examples, where we provide an environment that so these were people that were working alone, that were doing repairs. So it's fair to say that the system was in a dangerous state. It's broken down, hence the reason why they're there. And they've been told do the traditional hazard ID, and would it come as a surprise that the hazards are always the same? Crushing, entanglement, trapping. So of course it was all driven on hazards, not around the situation. So we changed it around so that they basically the system basically was there to help inform, help to instruct about the stuff that really mattered, but sought their permission. So rather than the worker, the system permitting them to start, the worker was seeking their permission if they believed that the system was in a safe enough state for them to actually commence the work. But what happened was that at the end of every job, we asked them to reflect on how they thought the work was going to occur versus how the work occurred. And we captured that and we asked them to record where did they have to make do. There was nothing about what went well, what didn't go well. It was just where did they have to make do. And the organisation was getting about 6,500 metrics a month from all these activities. So they went from getting no information to getting a whole lot of information, and it terrified them. But what we said to them was that this information that's being gathered is actually business intelligence. And what we want to do is we want to look for patterns from this information. And it's those patterns that should then allow the organisation to be curious and to dig in a bit deeper and get a better understanding about why those patterns coming about. So in their case, what we ended up doing is we simply formed a word cloud. And about once a month, a group of workers got together and they ran a mini learning team off the word cloud. Because they understood what those words were, what the context of those words were. And surprisingly, out of the 6,500 metrics a month, it always came down to about the same 4 or 5 streams. And those 4 or 5 streams is then what allowed the organisation to be a bit more curious and dig in and get better understanding. But does that sound interesting? It's sort of... Because...
Yeah, no. It definitely does. That's the kind of, I guess, the trick with learning teams is to try and synthesize a ridiculous amount of discovery down to something that's meaningful or valuable for operations to kind of sink their teeth into. So we're constantly trying to think of ways that we can add a little bit more rigor to our approach. Because we know that our system is pretty misaligned to how work actually gets done. Our system is pretty bloated. It's far from perfect. We've been a huge decluttering mission. So we're trying to use these learning teams approach to bring back essentially actions and projects for change to be able to drive improvements to bring that system a little bit closer to the work that happens.
In the next part of this podcast, we will continue the conversation about using learning teams and how to identify waste in safety systems and then to drive actions and improvements. Don't forget, in our final episode for the month, I'll be joined by my fellow colleagues Glynis McCarthy and Brent Robinson, and we'll conduct a mini learning team on the key threads and themes that emerged during our virtual tour of Australia. Please join us for episode 22 as we continue the learning journey of urban utilities. Thank you, listeners, for being part of this podcast. We'd love to hear your learnings from today or other topics you would like us to support you on. Go to www.podcastlearnings.com and be part of the community practice of learning teams at www.learningteamscommunity.com.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the host and its guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the company. Examples of analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based only on very limited and dated open source information. Assumptions made within this analysis are not reflective of the position of the company. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast, Jay Allen.